Good morning, everybody. I'm calling in live from Anaheim, California. I had a very long day of travel yesterday from New York, so bear with me if I'm a little jet lagged, but really excited to be with you all for a crack in the wholesale code. We have a lot of material to get through today, so we may not get to all of it, particularly in the third part, but hopefully there's a lot of information for those of you who are producers or who help producers try to get more wholesale sales relationships overall. So with that, don't want to waste too much time, so we'll jump right in and go over what we're going to cover today. So we're going to go into three main buckets of content. One is going to be understanding wholesale buyers and their systems. We'll go over wholesale market dynamics and especially in depth on institutional buyer types. Then we're going to go into assessing producer readiness, so assessing your own readiness to engage in wholesale sales as a producer. And then we'll put it all together and talk about moving through the sales process or assisting someone with moving through the sales process as we try to re-regionalize our food systems. And I just want to make a note too that overall, we're going to be focusing on institutional and corporate types of purchasing and sales. So hospitals, universities, school systems, food banks, employee cafeterias. Some of the principles and tactics we'll learn today can translate over to things like retail, but by and large, we're just going to be focusing mostly on the food service channel. And to tell you a little bit about me and SupplyChange, my business, I founded it in 2020, and we essentially exist to re-regionalize food systems. We're a boutique firm based in New York and California, and we really particularly focus on a couple of main core focuses. One is developing and launching sourcing pilots with food service operations. And second, we also do all kinds of place-based initiative building in different parts of the country. And then we also do advising and training for nonprofits, government, and so on, and also for producers and for producer advocates, much like this one. We're currently active in 8 states across the country and like to take a lot of the data that we generate, again, from those food service pilots and generate more learnings with our partners on those advising and training initiatives as well. So getting into the bulk of what we're going to be going into today, I first want to frame up that success in sales is a combination of two main things, right? Producer readiness and buyer readiness. When those two things come together, we of course get sales, which is the ultimate goal of a lot of us who have farm or ranch or seafood businesses. But we also get trust. And trust is really what makes businesses and regional economies more enduring, more resilient, more sustainable over time. And of course, deepen sales relationships so that they are enduring, ideally beyond multiple generations. And when we layer all the kinds of networks of those sales networks, those trust networks, we get the social, economic, and ecological change that we're all seeking. So just to kind of show how sales is just an entry point to the deeper levels of social change that we want to achieve. So we achieve that by, again, leaning into producer readiness and buyer readiness. So first we'll tackle the world of buyers. And this is a kind of meaty slide, but the main things I want you to come away with are that our food system, especially over the last 30 years, has been shaped by market consolidation. That's companies acquiring other companies in a way that makes those few handful of companies very, very powerful. And it really shapes what we can do when we're trying to re-regionalize our food systems. So that slightly blurry bar graph at the bottom shows you kind of the main distributors in our country. Those two largest bars on the left represent Cisco and US Foods. You can see just how dominant they are, and that's data from 2014. So those bar graphs are actually much higher than they were at that time 10 years later. And then that chart up on the upper right represents what are called food service management companies. We're going to go into those in a little bit more detail in a second. But essentially, a food service management company is when an institution says, I want another company to manage my culinary, my operations, my hiring, my procurement. These food service management companies, as you can see from the bar graph, also really dominate the institutional market. So 81% of colleges and universities in this country work with one of these FSMCs. So what this means for us is that large distributors and these FSMCs, they really only focus on efficiency instead of values. They see working with smaller and local producers as complexity that hurts their profits and their market share. They also have these arrangements that are called rebates or kickbacks, where food service management companies will go to US Foods, for instance, and say, I will do business with you and give you an exclusive contract. And in exchange, you have to pay me back a percentage of your sales. That's called a kickback. And it locks out small producers because that means that chefs who are placing orders don't want to work with anyone who doesn't give them that kickback. So it's really, really bad for having resilient local regionalized food systems. These types of contracts are also really, really long. Sometimes they're as long as 10 years. And they can prevent pressure and change from happening. So even if, say, you get a sustainability director at a Sodexo-controlled university, they might say, great, I actually really want to work with local farmers. They might look at that contract that they have with US Foods or Cisco and be surprised to learn that they actually can't do much to change that contract. That's representative of a lot of what I've learned in the field, that many institutions don't actually understand a lot of their own barriers. So when they set out to work with local farmers, they may not realize just how many barriers are in place. Just to give you a little bit more detail on that food service management company situation, because it really shapes a lot of what SupplyChange is engaged in. If a university, for instance, is not working with an FSMC, that means they're called self-operated or self-op. So that means they hire and manage their own staff. They design their own menus. They make their own contracts with their own distributors. They're essentially independent. It's usually easier to work with a self-op institution, but they still might have a long, enduring contract with a corporate distributor of some kind, or they might have other complications that still make things difficult to work with. So there's some nuance there. For outsourced or institutions that do work with these FSMCs, so if the big three, they're called Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass Group, and they also have many, many subsidiaries that are roll up under those big three companies. That means that they're called outsourced and they have to buy a certain amount from their contracted suppliers in that kickback arrangement that I described. If you want more information on that and more details, Real Food Challenge put out an amazing report some years ago in 2020 called Be Trade that goes into all of how this works in detail in a very readable way. So essentially, it makes it harder at the outset, but there are still some program opportunities. There are some FSMC subsidiaries that find ways to make this work and find workarounds, and we've found some success doing that, especially if you can get in, if they have a relationship with a smaller distributor. There's many opportunities you can generate there. So neither one is, all black or white or perfect or imperfect. It's all imperfect and a little bit nuanced, and you have to take it case by case. But this is just to give you a broader picture of some of the wholesale food system dynamics. So breaking it down in a much more simple way. If you are a smaller or regional producer and you're trying to do business and somebody comes up to you and says, hey, we work with Cisco or we work with US Foods, can you work with them? Avoid that. It's going to be nearly impossible in my experience to get that going. If the buyer you're working with says, hey, can you work with my regional distributor, such as a Midwest Foods, go ahead and proceed. That's going to be much more manageable to work with a distributor of that scale. Same thing if you're working with a food hub, go ahead and proceed. That's going to be an ally to you who can help you navigate the wholesale market. If you are engaged with an FSMC like a Sodexo, an Aramark, Compass Group, or one of their subsidiaries, proceed, but make sure you have the support you need to help navigate whatever situation you're walking into, because it can vary wildly. Some very quick case studies for you just to illustrate this more. UC Santa Cruz, for instance, ended its contract with Sodexo, so they went from outsourced to self-op in 2004 after students organized and asked them to end that contract with Sodexo. So the university now is self-op, but because UC Santa Cruz is part of a larger system, the University of California system, which is a client of ours, there is a system-wide contract with a distributor that is owned by a much larger international corporation. And that distributor has a very mixed track record when working with underserved and local producers. So even though it's self-op, there are still some complications. On the other side of the coin, Supply Chain has been having a successful working relationship with Good Eating Company, which is a subsidiary of Sodexo, so an outsourced FSMC situation. We were able to set up a pilot with them that has been running since 2021, getting BIPOC and regenerative producers into 8 Good Eating Company accounts. So Broadcom, PayPal, Genentech, some tech and biotech companies in the Bay Area. Because they work with one regional distributor called Vesta Food Service, we were able to negotiate and work with that smaller distributor, which serves the whole state of California, and develop new processes that allowed those farmers to get in the door. I'm going to go over broadly some institutional buyer types and some of their nuances. So hospitals, universities, schools, and corporate dining are the main types of buyers that we work with at SupplyChange to get farmers in the door. With hospitals, they have to be aware that there's multiple ways to get in the door. So one is patient meals, which is the most difficult because most hospitals work with a third-party vendor that tends to work with a corporate distributor. Very difficult for a smaller farmer to get into. There's also what's called the retail space, which is those cafes. When you go into the hospital, there's a cafeteria, a cafe, somewhere you can eat inside the building. That, to me, is the most likely and viable way for most farmers to work with them because they work generally with smaller or mid-sized distributors, or they're more likely to. And then there's finally what's called the ambulatory space, which is just the outdoor area or the places where people are able to walk around. That's a place where hospitals can sometimes be open to having pop-up farmers markets or box programs. So again, a place for a smaller volume opportunity for farmers to participate in. Another aspect that is very common in hospitals is that their purchasing is governed by what's called a group purchasing organization, or a GPO. A GPO basically tells hospitals how much they can spend at different suppliers. So it's just something to be aware of whenever you're trying to work with a hospital. Be aware of what their GPO is and what the rules are there. We'll go into a little bit more of that later. For universities, as we just highlighted by the UC Santa Cruz example, there are university systems that often have contracts governing all of them. And then there's also independent private colleges that can be a little bit more easy to work with because you don't have those larger system dynamics to consider. There's also some seasonal difficulties because usually we know peak season is during the summer, early fall, and that's usually when the fewest students are eating. So it can be difficult sometimes to figure out how to get fall and spring shoulder seasons negotiated well and get them off the ground. They also have certain opportunities with station programs. They might say, we're setting up an organic station in this one dining hall, and that can be a good place to channel all of your efforts if you're aware of that opportunity or have someone helping you with that. They might also have special themed dining halls. For instance, they might have a vegetarian dining hall where they're really seeking plant-based foods. They might have a regenerative type of concept that they're trying to work out for a regenerative beef farmer to participate in, just things to look out for. It's also helpful to know that they might be using HE stars or the Cool Food Pledge or Real Food Challenge standards, and that can be something that you can use to negotiate. Hey, I meet HE stars 3.0. Hey, I meet real food standards, local and community-based economies. Those are ways that you can advocate for yourself as a farmer. We'll go into more of that later too. And then briefly, schools. Many of us who have worked with schools before are familiar with how schools really struggle to buy local food due to the massive amount of federal regulations that they face. Because they're spending public money, they have to put everything out to bid. There are formal bids, there are informal bids. So a lot of times I've found that local farmers have success working with schools on their micro purchases, which is sort of petty cash that schools can use. They can usually spend $2,500 to $5,000 just to try something out. So if you're approaching a school, it's a good introduction to starting a sales relationship with them if you can start with micro purchasing and then work on getting more formally included in their food service over time. With schools, of course, there's also lots of opportunity for grant funding. Farm to school grants in many states are common, and that can help subsidize food costs, do some scratch cooking infrastructure development that helps get more of your food in the door, et cetera. Salad bars, I've also found, are a great way to get in the door. And then again, we also see the seasonal difficulties that we see with universities. With corporate dining, we've had a lot of success here because budgets are higher and because they They want to cater to sort of like higher end food tastes of many of their employees. And they tend to hire more chefy types that come from farm to table restaurants, or they're more likely to. So they might have more flexibility and creativity and menuing to bring in more unique items that you might be growing. One thing to know also is that because much of corporate dining is outsourced to those FSMCs, you should know that those big three companies are starting to really compete against each other for who is offering more sustainable offerings. So just something to be aware of, that it can be an asset that we can use. And then food banks, of course, we all know that LFPA has been a massive opportunity for regional farmers. Many food banks are controlled, their commodity purchasing might be controlled by an approved list of fruit and vegetables that is dictated by the state or a statewide organization. That's certainly true in California. In Illinois, you must work, of course, with UI Extension to be approved to sell in the program. And then there's many nuances to navigate with different food banks, logistics, and requirements. For box programs, these are great for smaller farmers. So there's nonprofit community hunger distributions, food as medicine distributions. There could be special short-term opportunities, and these tend to be smaller volumes, but steadier ones as long as there is funding to support them. I've also noticed that they might have sort of underdeveloped ordering systems, lots of Google Sheets. So just something to know that if you're trying to develop more professionally, it may not map onto being able to sell to a much more rigorous buyer over time. So going further into how we work with buyers at SupplyChange, we have what we call our 3Cs framework for assessing buyer readiness. So remember that right side of the Venn diagram, buyer readiness is a massive part of what we're trying to assess for success. So each C is connections, capabilities, and commitments. Connections is all about what do they know about the local food system and how well connected are they to it. Capabilities is about how able are they to absorb local food into their food service operation? How prepared are they skill-wise, infrastructure-wise, menuing-wise, distribution-wise? Commitments is all about what are the values driving the local sourcing work that they are trying to do. Have they signed on to GFPP? Do they have internal policies? How engaged are their stakeholders, employees, et cetera? So going into this in a little bit more detail, this is a sort of a snapshot of how SupplyChange goes through and kind of formally evaluates the 3Cs for different projects. So we adapt our 3Cs. We've adapted it for USDA. We've adapted it for corporate clients. But this is just an example of how we might do that. So we might rate their local food system familiarity. We might evaluate their existing and previous relationships with local producers. Have they ever attempted to source before? How did it go? Do they have someone they're really trying to work with, or are they just starting out and being like, who's out there? Do they have active partnerships with nonprofits, with farm advocates, et cetera, with government? How connected are they to the local food system in that way? For capabilities, we might look at what kind of kitchens do they have? Do they have staff that have access to knives and scratch cooking training? Do they have labor constraints? Meaning that, for instance, they can only take in pre-cut produce, therefore they can't take in your whole and fresh carrots with the green on top. Do they have flexibility in terms of the distributors they are working with? Are they only working with US Foods, which means that they have no flexibility? Or are they working with a smaller regional family-owned distributor that is able to amend their processes, is able to work with smaller producers in a much more productive way? And then menuing, we really emphasize this. Do they write menus, for instance, like many hospitals, one whole year out in advance that has nothing seasonal on it that can't be changed? That means that it's going to be really hard to bring in seasonal produce if they are not on the menu. And then do they have the ability to adjust them over time? So certain institutions that have had a lot of success with local sourcing have shortened their menu cycle to say 3 weeks long and are able to change it as more local things come in available. So a farmer might call and say, hey, I've got like a whole bunch of extra carrots. Like, can you take this on? So they will rewrite the menus to incorporate a couple more carrot-based items. And then we're able to flow, again, regionally and seasonally. And then, of course, commitments. Have they signed on to the Good Food Purchasing Program? Are they working with Healthcare Without Harm? internal policies they might have could be supporting minority and women-owned businesses. A lot of the clients that we work with have specific goals around working with more BIPOC producers, more local producers, more regenerative producers. And then this is a huge one, I think that is underrated, is do they have a champion who's going to make sure that this gets through all teams? And does that champion have both power and commitment to you? Do they have a task force that they're willing to convene to make sure work gets done? What we found is that if without this, there's no glue to hold a sales relationship together. So that's buyer readiness. And now let's dive into producer readiness. And what I want to emphasize is that, especially if you're a producer, this is an invitation to assess your own skills and goals without judgment, because a lot of this is skills-based readiness. So the first thing I think is important to know about yourself if you are a producer is your own archetype. Understanding your core identity and your goals, I think, is really crucial for matching yourself with the right buyer. So type 1 is what we can call sovereignty farmers. So these tend to be smaller, located near or in an urban area, prioritizing direct markets, so CSAs, really excelling at box programs, usually a highly diversified crop plan on small acreage, and unique culturally significant products are really common, strong community ties. The challenges, of course, for this type of farmer is that there's very limited capacity for larger scale orders. Pricing is really difficult to work into food service because of the relationship of small acreage and growing many crops on that acreage. That means that the price points tend to be much higher than food service can accept. They usually really need help getting certifications or compliance in order. And particularly if this farmer is a BIPOC farmer, there's a high risk of harm when exposing them to the wholesale system, which can be honestly cruel and a little bit cold at times. So a lot of care is needed and a community effort to work sovereignty farmers into the larger food system. Next, we can think of mixed market farmers. This is Leo of Bonita Farms, who is what I would call a classic mixed market farmer that we work with actually close by here in Southern California. So these are farmers that maybe started out with smaller acreage and as a farmer's market farmer, but then got a taste of wholesale sales and really want to shift into that. So they might acquire more land. They tend to be in a more semi-rural or rural area. They still have a lot of diverse product offerings and lots of flexibility, and they're really eager to learn and grow their business. They may need assistance graduating to higher levels of compliance, so getting new certificates, getting food safety in order. They may still be developing their business and marketing and communication skills. It's a huge jump to go from farmers market to wholesale. It's a whole different set of expectations and a lot to learn. And then finally, we have commercial farmers. So, and this is Adelio Coronel, who I work with in the Salinas Valley in California, who I would consider a commercial farmer. So these, of course, primarily focus on wholesale markets. They're usually very ready to sell. They have a streamlined crop plan. So even if they're maybe only growing on 10 acres, they're probably only growing 2 to 3 things. And compliance certifications are typically in place. They have a stronger understanding of pricing and costs in the market. What I see a lot in terms of challenges for this type of farmer is what I call the neighbor problem. So maybe they're growing in an area where there's lots of other farmers around. They're saying, hey, it looks like you did really good on red leaf lettuce last year. I'll grow that too. Soon, suddenly everybody is growing red leaf lettuce. And then there is a glut in the market and everybody suffers for it. So I find that commercial farmers tend to really need to find their niche. What is something that they really excel at growing at, that they love to grow, that stands out in the market? And of course, a commercial farmer, because they're growing fewer things, what they really need is more than 2, ideally 4 to 5 long-term enduring buying relationships. So assessing one's own wholesale readiness. Just going into a little bit more detail in terms of those skills that we were mentioning. Crop planning, I find, is an enormous one. Many of the farmers that I work with don't have a formal crop plan. They don't have it written down. It might be in their head. This makes it really difficult to work with them because we want to assess how the alignment of the crops they're growing are aligned with buyer demand. We want to share the market knowledge that we're bringing to them and try to see where they match up on paper. It's also really hard for farmers that do not have a formal crop plan to understand how much are you going to have and when. When negotiating on behalf of a farmer with a buyer, we want to be able to say, in July, there will be this many cases of tomatoes coming out of the ground. We also want to have a sense of course, what the quality and consistency of this grower's production is as well. Pricing, of course, is a topic that comes up really frequently in our work with producers. So it's really important to understand wholesale produce pricing structures. They are very different from farmers market pricing. We've worked with a ton of farmers who are very shocked to learn how different the pricing is between the wholesale and the direct market. So understanding one's own knowledge of your cost of production, how much does it cost you to grow what you grow? And then working from there to what your target gross profit margin should be. That will help us understand, how low can we go? How low can we negotiate for you? We don't want to go below what your target gross margin is. And then, of course, balancing costs and inputs with profitability. Is it worth it to add another crop? Should I streamline to all strawberries or to all, one other crop? These are all things to take note of when we're trying to work productively with pricing. A couple more notes on this, just to build on one of the points I was making earlier. These are screenshots from order guides from institutions that we work with. And you can see that a lot of the items are common things that we might grow. So like broccoli, bell peppers, mushrooms, etc. Sometimes it's a good idea to look at what's most commonly ordered in the highest volumes by an institution, but not always. Sometimes, if this makes sense, it's helpful to look a little bit lower down in the list for things that are slightly less commonly ordered, like cherry tomatoes, for instance, only ordered a couple of times a season, when, of course, in July and August when they're coming out of the ground. So really nailing something that is niche, but not too niche, is something that I always recommend for producers consider, rather than trying to go for something like competing with a Blue Lake green bean, which we will never be able to compete on price. This is a huge one too that I'm finding I'm having more conversations with producers about, which is business and marketing aptitude, particularly around communication and responsiveness. I was just speaking with a nonprofit client that is working as a sort of mini aggregator, and we were talking about setting expectations for farmers that it's really important to answer emails and texts within 48 hours maximum. And I don't think that producers know, if they, of course, emergencies happen and that can be really difficult, but just staying in communication on a regular cadence shows the market that they can trust you. Also having, marketing materials and branding that is appealing to buyers can be really important. So having an availability list is a great first step. A lot of growers we work with, we try to get them towards making a weekly availability list, and even better, a seasonal availability list, again, kind of aligned with that crop plan, so we can see what's going to be available and when. And then, of course, the one we all know of, compliance status. Food safety, third-party gap is so important for opening the door to so many more sales opportunities. Is it expensive? Yes. Is it annoying? Yes. And does it open a lot of doors? Yes, it sure does. Organic certification, of course, opens a lot of doors too, especially if you have a higher price point. And product liability insurance of at least $1 million is a must. We do find that sometimes larger buyers will say you need $2 million of insurance. We're usually able to negotiate that down, but having at least $1 million of coverage is a necessity. And then record keeping ability. This, for instance, is a huge skill that I really encourage all producers to develop, which is just having a folder on your computer and or on your phone that has your GAP certification if you have one, your organic certification, your W-9, your product liability insurance, a certificate of insurance, anything you need to get a sale so that you can easily fire it off to anyone who requests it. So many growers I work with will say, yes, I'll get that to you, or I'll go take a picture of it for you later. And then it falls off their list because they're so busy. It just saves everybody time if you have your documents organized in a way that's easy to access and send. And then packing, labeling, and distribution, another huge one. I worked with growers before that are reusing boxes that are breaking down in transit. We want to have nice, clean boxes. Generic packaging totally is completely fine. We don't need to have branded packaging, but managing that packaging inventory is really helpful. Knowledge of standard industry packs is questions I get a lot. So I'm always happy to help farmers and tell them what the standard industry pack is if they're packing something for a customer that they haven't packed before. Labeling ability. Different buyers will have different levels of strictness around what they require you to put on the box. They might require you to put everything around your lot code, your farm name and location, where the product is going, etc. So having a way, even if it's just a marker, finding out if that's okay, or having a label gun, these are all really important things. And we found that sometimes when this isn't in place or when a farmer misunderstands the instructions, it can cause a lot of problems. Understanding your own preferred delivery methods and routes. Do you have a refrigerated van or a non-refrigerated van? Do you only have a truck? How far are you willing to drive for an order? And what does your minimum order have to be to drive, say, more than an hour away? Having that stuff determined and having it easily communicated to buyers is really important. So here's a matrix that I worked with a client on who was helping farmers move through a program of professional development. So we talked about it in terms of seed, sprout, and bloom. So seed were farmers that were early on in their skills development. So we some inconsistent quality, some, again, boxes in poor shape are being reused, communications less responsive, inconsistent with delivery times, not able to stay on top of paperwork management, no food safety plan, no organic cert, not understanding their own costs to grow, their margins and volumes, and very few other sales outlets. And then you can see you kind of move through as you get some professional development support, some business support, you can graduate into bloom. So by the end of working with this client of ours, you'd hopefully have excellent quality. You'd have strong and responsive communication, great packaging management, always on time with delivery, fully up-to-date certs, et cetera, et cetera. It's also important when you're working with someone who's supporting you that they have a clear plan for how they're going to move you through phases like this, what feedback looks like, what action steps are. These are signs of a good working relationship for someone who can support you in improving your wholesale sales skills. For yourself too, it's also really important to think about impact effort mapping. So we know that producers have almost no time to do anything. Producers are overwhelmed, overworked. There's so many expectations of things that they need to do. So it's good to take an inventory and think about what's going to be high effort and versus high impact, right? So GAP certification, very high effort, takes a long time, is expensive, but we also know that it's high impact, right? Because it's going to open up so many sales doors for us. Developing a brand, so a logo and a social media presence, that's somewhat high effort, but it's also a little bit low impact. It might not be the most important thing for us to work on. It might be more important for us to work on things over here. Writing down my crop plan can take some days or some weeks, so it's not as high effort as a GAP certification, but just sitting down and doing some thinking and planning, working with a business advisor, et cetera, that can be higher impact. Organizing documents, I can't emphasize enough, it's high impact, and in my mind, it's not as high effort as something like getting GAP certified. So this is an exercise you can do for yourself, either mentally or in your notebook, just thinking through what are the things that are most important for me to focus on that are going to open the most doors, and coming up with a to-do list that way. So putting it all together, we're going to start talking about how we move through the sales funnel together. So putting together buyer readiness and farmer readiness now that we've gone through all of that. So overall, we want to assess when we have a buyer in front of us, what type of buyer is this? Are they self-op or are they outsourced? Is it direct delivery? Is it through a distributor? What are their onboarding requirements? What is being asked of me to have ready? Do they have experience working with local farmers? So again, going through that 3 C's type of thinking. What is their connections, capabilities, and commitments? Do they have any special programs or policies supporting regional producers? Who are the people that I'm talking to? Is it a sustainability manager? Is it a culinary manager? Who will make sure that sales happen? Do they have a champion? And then overall, is this buyer a fit for my business and sales goals, for my archetype, and my readiness? So just to work through this as an example, I am a farm. I'd like to sell to a hospital. As we discussed, there's multiple ways in the door to a hospital, right? So if I am a sovereignty farmer, probably the best thing for me to do is pursue something like a food as medicine box program. If there's not one already, talk to someone about how we can start that up. If there is one already, get plugged into it. For a mixed market farm, it might make sense to work through a couple of different entities to work with a retail pilot. So retail meaning, of course, again, those cafes and cafeterias where people eat inside the hospital. So a mixed market farm might work with a food hub, who then works with the hospital's FSMC, which might be a company called Morrison Healthcare, and sales get set up that way. For a commercial farm, they probably have the highest chance of success of getting in that third door for hospitals, which is patient meals. So a commercial farm might work with a broker who then sells to a distributor, who then sells to the third-party vendor that the hospital works with to make their patient meals, and then we're in business. So you can see how this all kind of shakes out, where each farmer archetype has different paths to success based on the type of buyer and institution that we're talking about. So this is the fun part, I think. Let me check my time. All right, I've got a good amount of time. So the sales funnel. This for me is really important for anyone who's engaged in sales to understand. There's different versions of this. This is the one that I liked. Essentially, it's a process of when you're engaging with a buyer, first you get their interest, then they evaluate you, then you negotiate, then they place an order, and then they commit to you. So interest, evaluation, negotiation, order, and commitment. Understanding where you are at all times is vital for sales success, in my opinion. And then remember, if the lead seems viable, if the buyer seems like they're serious about you and want to work with you, do everything you can to get to that order stage as fast as possible, because things really slow down in those first 3 steps. And we're going to go into detail about why. So for interest, whether you reach out to a lead or a lead reaches out to you, you can do something that we recommend doing, which is called power mapping. I can share a little bit more about that later. What we want to understand again is the person I am talking to on the culinary team. Are they a chef? Are they on the purchasing team? Are they on the sustainability team? Or are they on the marketing team? How much power do they have? How much do they care about me? Understanding their 3 C's. Again, what are their connections? What are their capabilities? What are their commitments? These are the types of questions that we can ask to understand at the interest level, is this worth pursuing? And then get clear, how do we move on to that next step of evaluation? How are the purchasing decisions made? Is the person I'm talking to going to be making the purchasing decision? I should have my paperwork and my information ready because people are going to start asking me for it. You want to make sure that your communication is strong and prompt and succinct, and you want to gather as much information as possible so that, again, you can make the best decision for you and your business and your energy and time over the coming weeks and months. So for the interest phase, say if you're reaching out to somebody in a cold outreach way, here's an example type of script that you can use. So you can mention a referral if you have one. You can show your familiarity with any particular opportunity they might have. So for instance, this farmer says to somebody who works at a school district, hey, I was referred to you by somebody at the Center for Good Food Purchasing. They let me know you're interested in local BIPOC produce because you have farm to school grant dollars. So you're showing immediately that you're familiar with what their goal is and that they have money to spend. Then you have a brief description of who and where you are, and it's really helpful to have attachments for them to review. So this is where that availability list can really come in handy. You can show product photos if you don't have an availability list. You can have a simple flyer that just tells your farm story, but this, just a short, brief email plus some attachments that they can review, really strong approach for the interest phase. Here's another example, just reaching out to a hospital. Hi, I've heard that Midwest Health is interested in sourcing more local BIPOC produce for a box program. So this might be a sovereignty farmer reaching out. And again, brief bio, attachments for them to review. If you're trying to get involved with a box program, really, really helpful to show a breakdown of what an example box can be. Here is a $30 box. It contains, a bunch of carrots, a bunch of beets, et cetera, et cetera. Really helpful to move things along. The people that you're reaching out to are just as busy as you are. So the less work that you can, make them do, the easier it is for them to move you to the next phase. The next is evaluation. So this is a time when a lot of potential deals can break down. The most important thing to do, again, is demonstrate your readiness. This is when they're going to ask you for all of your paperwork, really helpful to submit it on time. I really recommend setting up a regular meeting or touch point, task force, whether it's you participating or somebody representing you, which in some cases might be better. A lot of times for farmers, that's us representing them in meetings like this. You want to be able to show what you grow, what quantities you have, how long they're available. Many buyers forget that agriculture is on specific time. So for instance, I've had an experience where we were trying to negotiate a strawberries deal. The season goes in California from April to October. We had to remind, the buyer that strawberries stop being grown and harvested in October. And that helped us speed things up. Again, understanding all the compliance requirements is really important at this point, so you can understand whether it's a really good opportunity. Hey, they said they really want my stuff. If only I had GAP, maybe I can get GAP. Or hey, they don't really seem as interested as I thought. They said maybe if I get GAP, then they'll buy from me. That might be a good indication to walk away. So this is where they're evaluating you, but you are also evaluating them. This is, again, just more best practices, making sure all of your documents are in order. I think I've drilled that one in enough. Here's an example crop plan that one of the growers that we work with had prepared for potential clients. As you can see, there's many different ways to do this, but this is just an example for you to see. Here's another grower that we work with. They have on the right side, you can see their weekly availability list. And then on the left side is their seasonal availability list. So you can see they have the crop that they're growing, the description, the case pack, their pricing, how many cases they expect to be available per week, really, really helpful. And then the date range, again, roughly for when the season for each thing is. This makes it really easy for a buyer to look in and assess, oh, great, I can plan out some summer programs for this. So it just saves so much time and effort on everybody's part if you have that kind of mapped out and written down. Negotiation. This is a fun stage. If you get past evaluation, it is a huge achievement, but also things can really fall apart here as well. So it's good to stay sharp. So you should have a strong understanding of, if you are working with the buyer a little bit more directly, you should understand kind of who everybody is in the situation. This is less important if you're working with a food hub or a distributor who is representing you. But the more you know, of course, always the better. You should know, again, who's on culinary, who's on sustainability, who's on purchasing, who's the most important person who needs to hit the order button for you or make sure that somebody's hitting the order button. This is where also price gets negotiated. So again, understanding how low you can go, what your bottom line is helpful. And then again, re-emphasize over and over that you are an agricultural producer. You're on a specific timeline. If we're trying to get a deal done on something that's going to be stopped harvesting soon, you need to make that ultra clear. If you hit a problem, if you have a champion, go ahead and escalate it, or to escalate it to the person who's helping you with the sales process. And then here on the right is some example scripts of how we can re-engage people if they've fallen off of their email or the phone, for instance. So sometimes buyers might shut down. If you send them a price list, sometimes they might just stop answering their email because they think you're too high. I've had success asking buyers, hey, show me what you're paying with other suppliers or distributors. And then we can actually look and be like, hey, actually the farmer's willing to meet you or match this price on certain things, or at least get close to it. So that can help restart. This is probably something that most producers would need external support for, but this is something we've done for growers. It's called a variance analysis. So we found that a public hospital system that we were working with, they showed us the things that they wanted to buy more locally. And we found that when they were looking at the prices we were showing from local growers, the local grower prices looked much higher than they actually were. And that's because the hospital wasn't looking at how much it actually was per portion. Their distributor was selling them things in smaller boxes than the local farmers were. So the local farmers looked more expensive. So green beans, for instance, looked like $51, while the distributor green beans looked like $28. But when you actually compare what that, per portion price was, we found that the local farmer was actually 26% cheaper. So you may not always be able to do this full spreadsheet analysis, but it's just something to look out for, that the buyer may make mistakes like this. They may not notice that the price you are quoting is in a different case pack than their original price. So just something to be aware of. More best practices here. When you have price information, if you know what they're paying, so for instance, if you know that Cisco FreshPoint is charging them $30 for strawberries, you can say, hey, I'm going to charge 32 for strawberries. So the more market information that you have, the more you can negotiate with the buyer. And then here's just some example scripts for how we can engage someone's best self during the negotiation process. I find this to be really useful. And always a disclaimer, you can't negotiate your way out of nonsense. Sometimes the buyer is just not going to be acting rationally. They might be busy with other things. They might be acting irresponsibly. And that nonsense is not about you. And sometimes it's best for your own protection of your energy to just walk away. If we get to the order phase, and if somebody places an order with you, that is a huge achievement. So remember to celebrate. And then also, after you're done celebrating, remember to prepare to troubleshoot and just move through a bit of conflict together and ensure that that conflict is generative and productive. So always plan for some level of miscommunication. It's so common. It's not a disaster. It literally happens with every new buying relationship, whether it's the smallest farmer or the largest corporate distributor. For instance, I was just, there's a corporate headquarters here in Southern California. We had spent months negotiating, getting a local farm onboarded to sell produce to its food service operation and do a veggie box program for employees. But then the farmer had a family emergency and wasn't able to call and let people know. So the delivery didn't happen. The corporate headquarters was very upset and considering, canceling the whole thing. So we just had to help step in and manage the conflict. And now the deal is back on. So always be ready for some kind of shenanigans to happen. One way to head off one of the most common problems is around quality. So buyers might be used to, different quality standards or different ways that produce might look from a corporate supplier, right? So your purple broccolini might look different than the regular green broccolini that they get from some large distributor. So it's always helpful to take photos of you harvesting and packing it, send it over to the buyer in whatever way you can, and just show them what it looks like before you deliver it. That really, really helps set expectations and head off conflict before it can happen. So always a good best practice. And then finally, if we have a number of orders that go really well together, then we can arrive at the commitment stage. So after a season of sales, always a good idea to request a feedback meeting with your core contacts, ask how things have gone, see if they had any feedback or requests. One farmer that we work with at UC Irvine, we found that as he was turning over into the new season, he changed some of his prices, but without really realizing that he'd made bigger changes than he thought. And UC Irvine kind of was like, hey, wow, I didn't realize you're too expensive. So they just stopped ordering things. We had to bring the conversation back together. We fixed the pricing problem, normalized it, but just always over communicate if you can, see how sales are going. If you're working with a distributor or a food hub too, it's always a good idea to ask for feedback. It shows maturity, it shows willingness to improve, it shows responsiveness. You can ask things like, hey, how do the chefs like the quality and variety? Are there more things we could do? For one of our clients, that Good Eating Company case study I mentioned earlier, after a year and a half of sales, we worked with them to have a chef survey where we said, what do you like about the program? Are there things you would change? The feedback we got was incredible. They wanted more variety. They wanted more consistency. They wanted changes to the order process. And due to that feedback, we were able to grow the program to more growers, to a standing order, and got the program even more permanent than it was before. So that feedback, even though it can be a little bit scary to receive, it can also really help deepen the sales relationship, deepen the trust, and ensure greater and greater sales. Getting to a standing order is a huge achievement too. I never recommend starting out with a standing order if you can avoid it, because again, of that initial bumpiness that new sales relationships can have. But after you've sorted through, gotten some feedback, it is a good idea to start moving towards exploring whether a standing order makes sense. That means that you can have a portion of your sales locked in for a season. It helps inform your ever maturing crop plan, and then you can focus your energy on gaining new sales. So actually, I think that about wraps up the content that I have. One thing I want to mention is that we don't charge farmers at all for our services. We welcome all farmers into our farm network. We only charge our nonprofit and corporate clients in order to help them bring producers into their supply chains. So if you want to join our farm network, it's completely free. We're happy to send you our free farm toolkit that has lots of the principles that we've discussed today. So it has pricing guide for you to show what you can expect from regional and corporate distributors, from food hubs, and from the direct market. It has a volume calculator in it to show you at what point it makes sense to switch over to wholesale sales versus direct marketing sales. It has an example tool of that variance analysis I showed you so that you can compare your own pricing to other pricing that you may have access to from other competitors. It has an example power map so you can kind of help track who are the people within the buyer that I'm talking to, who's on culinary, who's on purchasing, who's on marketing. And then it also has a cheat sheet for if you're trying to work with someone who is trying to work with Good Food Purchasing Program or Real Food Standards or Healthcare Without Harm. We have a cheat sheet to show where you might meet certain qualifications within that framework. So the QR code is there. If you click that one or join that one, you can join our farm network, again, completely free, or you can send us an email at hello@supplychange.co.